Well, those two newts are getting acquainted. I'm going to do just a short, quick video on how to set up a good setup for them. A lot of people ask me that question, and I'm going to give you the very best answer. I don't have my big 150-gallon breeder tank set up anymore. That's been taken down, and that was actually quite a bit of work. It was all furnished, live plants, live moss, live reeds, and I just had submersible. They would be kind of like hang-on back filters, but they were submerged in the water. And so I'm just going to kind of demonstrate with a couple of tanks what to do. Now these newts are terrestrial. They are not fully aquatic, so they like to get out of the water. Their biggest preferences are to be in areas where it's wet, but not fully aquatic. Now the males will stay in the water all year round. Even when it's done with breeding season, you'll find them out in the pools and the lakes, and in captivity it's this exact same way. So make sure you have water in the tank always. That's a must. I can't even stress that enough, because they can actually dry out quite quick. Even though they are mostly terrestrial, they live in a damp environment. So what I would do, this is a 60-gallon tank. Obviously you don't need a Flowable FX5 canister filter. That's just for the fish. I don't have my lights on right here on this particular tank. I get gravel and I get sand, and I mix them together. They make a great combo, and of course rocks. I would fill it about that high all the way across the tank, and then you would fill it up with water. Now I would dish out maybe a stream in my 120 gallon. I took out like a kind of a mid stream so that there was like a stream with a big deep pool at the end, and then your water level needs to match just under the level of the substrate. That's what I like about sand and gravel, is the water travels through it great. It filters the water out great, keeps it clear year round, along with pretty good filtration and a good biological setup with different plants. Wild bamboo is one of the greatest things. It's almost impossible to kill, and the newts like it, along with duckweed and a couple other aquarium plants. Do quite well with them. And then I would do another thing that is kind of hard to describe on paper. It'll be much easier to describe in person. Is, let's say that you had your water level up to here and your gravel level up to here, and so it's going to be dry in some parts. You can make it high, and it's going to be wetter in some other parts. I'd scoop out shallow pools every now and then, and so that the water would be like yay deep in like a small little section, so that they had some areas to get where it was wetter, and then I would have other areas where I'd have the water level and the gravel perfectly put together, and so that was always wet, and that was their most favorite spot for the majority of the newts to be, for the young ones, for the older ones, and they would really like those spots. The easy hides are just rocks hollowed out. You get from like a pet store the dome-shaped pieces of wood. Make sure you just wash them out pretty good. Most of my stuff I always collect from outside, because you can use things from outside very easily, and it's usually some of the best looking. If you use rocks, I would suggest boiling them before using them. That gets rid of all parasites and bacteria and whatnot. Just about everything dies at about 265 degrees. And do the same thing with wood pieces you collect outside. You can boil it. Now I boil wood in a big turkey fryer that I have, and I like to do that just because it does a couple things. It waterlogs the wood as well as sanitizes it. But more popular thing to do is to bake the wood in the oven. Most people don't have pots big enough to boil pieces of wood, but you can bake it in the oven as well. 265 degrees for 10 minutes. It should kill just about everything. And that's how you sanitize wood. And that is my highest recommendation for a newt setup. is the gravel with the water line meeting the gravel, and then you'll have it shelled out. If you put it about 6 inches, so you can have the water about 6 inches deep when you dig out your pools and whatnot. And it's also nice because your filter will filter all the water in the entire cage. It doesn't matter where the water goes, it's going to get filtered because it diffuses through the sand. Now, the other method is, I'm going to have to go into the other room for that. The fully aquatic setup, or mostly aquatic setup, it's very simple. Rocks on the bottom, make sure they have some ramps to get out of, and you can even just use fake plants. You noticed in the small breeding tank that I showed you before that's holding the eggs, it just has plants and fake plants. And a filter. This is the filter I was talking about that I like to submerge. I wish I could remember the brand. It's a Terra filter, but it's pretty common turtle filter. And this is probably one of the best that I've used that works for newts. They come in different sizes. I think they only go up to maybe, there's my little diamondback terrapin that lives inside for now until he's big enough to go outside. But they only go up to 30 gallons, maybe 40 gallons I think. So this is a 30-gallon tall. You could fit quite a few newts in here if you wanted to, as long as there are plenty of hiding spots. This would actually be a great newt setup, and I have a couple live plants in here. These are extremely hardy plants. These are Java ferns, probably the most popular, one of the most popular aquatic plants that there is. I had some Anubis in here earlier, but I think I took it out. And anything in the Anubis genus is extremely hardy too. They're all low light plants, low demanding plants. And if you want a list of easy to grow plants, just go ahead and message me or send me an email, and I already have a list of those. I do have one newt in here actually. He's a fully aquatic newt, and I don't see him right now. He usually hangs up behind these rocks, but he's nowhere to be seen today. Just the terrapin. He's starting to outgrow this cage a bit. You could do something like this. This is one of my poison dart frog setups, where you have a lot of ground and then you have pools. Obviously those dishes are not big enough for newts. Most people would say, yeah, that's fine, but I wouldn't risk it. Now this is sealed on the top, so the humidity is extremely high, so it would actually be not too bad. The humidity is actually 47%, and it's 83 degrees in there. That's too low of a humidity. I'm going to have to miss that pretty soon and fill my fountain back up that runs in the middle, and I guess one of my plants fell down. But this is just one species of poison frog that I keep. And this wouldn't be a bad setup if you want a mostly terrestrial setup. You can have a lot more plants and make it a lot more lush. Just make sure that you can keep it cold, because a lot of these plants like it warm. These are mostly different kinds of orchids and subtropical plants. Bromeliad. So you can't keep these exact plants, but you can. It definitely improves your species variety that you can keep. But you would need a water dish. I would recommend a water dish that they can just put some fake plants on the edge, or some kind of ramp that they can get in and out of, at least 2 inches deep and 6 inches across, and make sure that you keep it topped off all the time. It's easier to just have a bigger water dish, and you clean it out every other day, or maybe or as needed. You can get filters that actually set in water dishes. I used to have one. I still do have one. I just don't know where it is. And I used to use it for my Argentine tegu because he had such a giant water dish. And it's not a huge filter. It just has a small carbon base. And you just submerge it in your water dish and you run the electrical cord out, and it just recirculates the water there, and it's actually works quite well. and so you wouldn't have to do water changes on the bowl very often. If you kept it set up like this, you could more than likely I would take the bowl and dump it on the plants when it's time to water the plants, but it's definitely too hot in there. You'd need a screen top. That amount of light is just a little bit much. What kind of lights do I have on this? Okay, it's just 2 T8s. That's a little too much light. They live in the forest where it's heavy with a lot of oak trees, and they don't get to see a ton of light all the time. So they're never in full sun. They're also just kind of in partial shade all the time. So if you had a thicker canopy, that would work out fine, but definitely would avoid the screen top. They're not great climbers. If you notice in the other cage, I don't even have a lid on it, and I've never had a newt escape. They can't climb anything that's glass for the most part. Now, keep your eye on it, and don't quote me on that, but I've never had one climb out. And in my big 150 gallon, I never had one climb out. And it just had a very loosely fit top lid with screen. The reason I had that was because, well, I had frogs in there too as well with the newts. So you can go either way. You can go aquatic setup, semi-aquatic setup, terrestrial setup. As long as their needs are met, they will be happy. So I know a lot of people that do it a lot of different ways, just as normal husbandry skills, and each way works, and some ways are easier than others. The fully aquatic setup is probably the easiest, but in my opinion, the semi-aquatic setup is the most rewarding, and I prefer, as you can see, I have a lot of planted fish tanks, actually shrimp tanks, but I prefer live plants, and that can be a challenge, and that's a whole another ball game. But to me, that's much more rewarding. I really am not a fan of fake plants, and but it does make for something that's 100 times easier to use, and you can use both. As I have fake plants and I have live plants in there, some real hardy ones, like I mentioned before. Let's see, all aquatic mosses are pretty decently hardy. That's Christmas moss, that's mini Christmas moss, actually that's Singapore moss, and the one on the back is more mini Xmas moss. Those plants do super well. They prefer high light, and they're actually pretty hardy. There's more of the hornwort. That plant is literally considered an invasive weed, so it's really easy to grow. This is water wisteria. This plant here, also considered one of the easier plants to grow. It looks nice, but it does require a little bit of a highlight situation. This is probably the easiest moss of all mosses to grow, and that's Java moss. So you just remember Java fern and Java moss. And Java moss grows in low light quite well, and it actually does a really good job of filtering out the water and keeping it clear. Plants in the back are just assorted. I think I have some Rotala back there species, and that's obviously it's a really nice looking sword plant. There's other plants too that are easy to grow. Right there, you can see that is a plant that is called round pellia. If you Google round pellia or just pellia, P-E-L-I-A, you'll come up with different things that you can buy it from. It's not cheap, but it also grows in basically any condition that you can imagine. That's not a dead shrimp there, by the way. I've been looking at that. That's a shrimp molt, and I don't take the shrimp molts out. You see there's no meat in there, but because the shrimp will come down and eat them, and that just goes right back into their ecosystem there. So that's a couple plants that I can recommend to put in with your cage. This is one of my favorite plants. This is pennywort. I like it. It's because it's, again, extremely hardy, easy to grow plant. and it grows in high light and low light and all conditions. It's filled up the side of that there. I've trimmed that a million times. Let me think, is there anything else that's really easy off the top of my head? The stuff you see up front, this is Blixa japonica, not the easiest plant to grow. That's mostly for aquariums. This is pearlweed. It's a slower growing plant, usually requires aquarium-like conditions. There's a tiger lotus in the back there. If you can see, let me show you a bigger tiger lotus. Tiger lotuses are really easy to grow. And that's back out here. Tiger lotus, a true tiger lotus, there's often a plant that's sold in its stead. That's a dwarf water lily that'll be sold as a tiger lotus. It's not a tiger lotus, it's a dwarf water lily. But it grows really well in pond-like conditions and cold water. This is, I'm going to move my desk aside here. This is a tiger lotus. They get huge and big, and they are one of the most beautiful plants in the aquatic scene that you can get. In my opinion, they are just the epitome of beauty. They are my favorite of all the aquatic plants. And they get green in low light, and they get that red in highlight. So it depends on the condition. I've actually tried pretty hard to get these to turn green. I've had nothing but red plants in this, red leaves, which most people desire, but I actually like it's an emerald green with red. It's really beautiful. It'll send up pads to the top, and it's a pretty durable plant. I keep big catfish, I keep the big fish in here, and even some crayfish, and they don't mess with it too much, so it's pretty durable, especially when we come to newts. And let's see, this is a very low light tank that is in desperate need of a water change. Where's my light switch? Won't change it too much, but that's another tiger lotus that I pulled off the main one. I pulled like 16 babies off of it one day. And that's one of the babies that's growing down on the bottom. It's really beautiful. This plant here is not the easiest to grow, but some people will tell you it's easy to grow. I just have never had tons of luck with it, just only in this tank. And this is jungle val. If you Google that, it'll pop up with all kinds of different vals. There's the crayfish. Another plant that's pretty easy to grow, but it can be semi-toxic, is crypts. The cryptocorne plant comes in a wide variety of plants, pretty decently easy to grow if it doesn't get uprooted. Make sure that if you want to trim it though, I wouldn't trim it in the water. I wouldn't trim Anubis species in the water either, because they've known to produce toxins when they're trimmed. And I haven't noticed any of them being particularly bad towards newts, but you never know. Not in 3 years I've had Anubis and crypts in there, but I just don't like to risk it. Probably not a big deal. There's more of the vals coming up. That's going to make a nice reedy-like pool in there. You can try your luck at a couple of vals. The jungle val is one of the easiest and one of the most underwater reed-like looking plants. This is a different kind of sword plant. They come in wide varieties. See, this is a more slender style sword plant here. This one's much bigger. I'm not quite sure on the species off the top of my head, but they do well in, as you can see, this is a pretty rough conditions. These are tough fish, and these are kind of tougher conditions. This is my natural species kind of a tank. This is a bluegill that I've raised from a tiny little guy. And all these others, channel catfish in the back and a crayfish in here. There's a couple other fishes that are actually, it's a loach, some Chinese algae eaters. But more native California species in this tank. The water is, I haven't done a water change in like 2 weeks in this tank. It needs a water change now. So tomorrow's going to be my water change day, and I'll probably do a 75% water change on this tank. It'll be crystal clear tomorrow. And so that's kind of a little briefing on the tank and the plants. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. I can send you the lists. A lot of people ask me if I sell the plants, and I do, but I don't always have them because I just sell my trimmings and what I have extra. So I don't always have them in stock, but I'm usually more than happy to send you some plants for free, some extra trimmings of some easy to grow plants. Let me show you one more. Here are 3 floating plants that I highly recommend. If any of you out there are really know anything about ponds or lakes, you're probably familiar with duckweed. Ironically, I've run into a couple people lately who haven't, which is strange, but if you've ever seen any kind of pond or lake anywhere, it almost always will have duckweed. And that's one great biological filtration method that you can use as a floating plant. And then there's this right here. This is called frog bit, and it's also pretty readily accessible. If no one has it, ask me about it because I'll have it. It's much bigger than duckweed, as you can see, way bigger, and it grows probably just as easily. If you grow it long enough, it'll get nice little flowers on it. If it is in high enough light, the roots of it are usually deeper in this tank, I think. If it's really happy and there's a lot of good food for it to eat, the roots will go all the way down to the ground, but normally they don't get this long. I attribute the deep roots of these plants to the fact that this is just a nice supplemented shrimp tank, and so they normally don't get that deep. But if you have a lot of iron in your tank too, the leaves will turn a nice red coloration. And so frog bit's a great floater for newts because it's pretty tough, and it's tough against the newts, it's tough against everything else too. It's easy to grow in low light and in high light. Obviously it's not going to grow faster in low light, but it does well in under both conditions. And the third plant for floating that I would recommend is this, if you can get a hold of it. I will occasionally have extras, but I don't always. And this is dwarf water lettuce. A lot of people who have ponds are familiar with water lettuce. A lot of people in the hobby are really familiar with water lettuce. But for a smaller theme, this is actually my favorite of all the floating plants. It needs very low amounts of water turbulence, or else that can kill it. So that works to our advantage in raising and breeding newts. It's a good place for newts to hide under. They're not going to eat it, obviously, because they're carnivores. It's a pretty plant, and it also gets a flower on it too. And the roots are a little bit different. The roots of the water lettuce have more shoots, a little bit more varied, and they're quite thick. For just a few plants, you get a nice underwater scape there. And the roots on these always get like that. Unlike the frog bit, which the roots will usually only get about that deep, and they're not too invasive. These get a little bit deeper, and I like them quite a bit. Here, it's a good shot of the difference of the roots in different plants. Short roots, these are about an inch and a half to an inch. Now this isn't an extremely well balanced aquarium for high-grade shrimp. So this is going to be a little bit different. You probably won't get roots this deep, but it does make a nice place for the newts to hide. They have this exact same duckweed in their natural environment, and it's extremely easy to propagate, and once it covers too much, you just net it out and throw it away and it'll fill right back in. This is a great plant. And then we have a little bit longer roots of the frog bit. So the two floating plants that I would definitely recommend putting one or all of these in with your newts. Not only because they condition the water really well. As you see, the water is very clear in my tanks, and I actually don't have very much filtration. This particular tank does have a canister filter, but the others don't. I rely more on biological filtration than anything else, and so when they get too prevalent, you just scoop them out. So it's kind of like a natural filter, and you get little bugs on them, which is great because newts will eat anything that's from the size of a fruit fly all the way up to the size of a maybe semi-medium cricket. So that's my last recommendation of plant. If I ever come up with anything else, I'll either add it to my care sheet or be alerting people to its availability.